All right, so this video is going to be on a collection of topics that Aquinas addresses, all of which have something to do with the appropriateness of violence. We're going to start with war. This is actually probably Aquinas's, although he's not the first one to come up with this theory, he's the most famous proponent of this theory, and it's called just war theory. And this is probably his most famous theory, or at the very least, it's the theory of his which is the most widely accepted today. If you were to join the military and go to one of the military academies to become an officer, you would be taught a modern version of effectively the theory I'm about to describe, just war theory. Sometimes people will distinguish sort of modern just war theory, which is widely accepted by military professionals, but also just by almost everybody who's not a pacifist and so doesn't think war is always wrong, and who's not sort of an amoralist who thinks you can do anything you want in war. Basically, anyone who's not one of those two positions accepts a version of just war theory. And Aquinas's presentation of it is the sort of source for all the presentations of it now. We will look at contemporary Catholic just war theory towards the end of the course, and you'll see that there are some differences, mostly in the form of expansions on Aquinas. There's no out-and-out disagreements with Aquinas, but there are sort of more principles added to the theory. But let's talk about the theory. So you might have thought, if you're familiar with the Bible, that Christianity is incompatible, let's make this a little bigger, with war, and that you can't wage war consistent with Christianity. There's lots of parts of the New Testament that sound that way. And not just the New Testament, there's parts of the Old Testament as well. Seems like war is going to force you to violate the commandment that you don't, intentionally kill people, murder people. But while some Christians have interpreted the Bible so as to require pacifism, that's just sort of necessity not been the dominant view. And the reason for that is Christianity, like most religions, has spread by becoming the religion of the rulers of a country, or rulers of a kingdom, or rulers of an empire. And then the rulers of that kingdom, country, or empire promote Christianity within that kingdom, right? So this is the way it happened in England, for example. Before there even was in England, there were a bunch of little English kingdoms. And the way Christianity sort of spread a second time in England, because it actually had been there during the Roman Empire, was they went from kingdom to kingdom and they converted the kings. And then the kings said, all right, this is my religion now, so all my nobles have to become members of this religion. And once my nobles become members of this religion, then they're going to force, the people just below them in the feudal hierarchy to become Christians. And you can't convert kings if you tell them they have to give up war. Because at that point, especially in the Middle Ages, they just had to give up being kings. The first Christian ruler of the Roman Empire, Constantine the Great, went to war all over the place. And couldn't have been emperor if he wasn't prepared to go to war. So it was important, just as a practical matter, to develop a justification of war consistent with Christian ethics. But it also, there were genuine intellectual reasons, apart from, we won't be able to spread the religion if we don't do this. Pacifism is, especially in the context of the Middle Ages, something that's just going to get you killed. Once people realize you won't fight back, they're just going to take everything from you, including your food, and you'll die of starvation. And, a kingdom that won't defend itself will get conquered. A person who won't defend themselves will get killed. And so the idea was there needs to be some way to justify this, consistent with Christian ethical teachings. Central to which is the claim that you're just not in general allowed to kill people, that violence is in general wrong. So there has to be some really compelling reasons to use violence if you're going to do it in a way that's consistent with Christian teaching, Catholic tradition, things like that. And that's what just war theory is. Now, for Aquinas, there are three elements of just war theory. There are, in fact, three standards you have to meet for something to be a just war. One, it has to have, or the war has to be declared by an appropriate authority. Basically, the ruler of a kingdom has to be the one to declare war. Private individuals can't declare war. Now, this standard is a little weird, in part because anyone who failed to meet this principle, or any conflict that failed to meet this principle, it's not like it would be an unjust war because of that. We just wouldn't even call it a war, right? Like if I get into a fight with my neighbor, that's not a war, that's just a fight. If I go down to the local, protest, let's say somebody is, there's some QAnon protest claiming that lizard people are everywhere and they're stealing children, and I get into a fight with some of the QAnon people, that again is not a war, even if I bring some friends. That's just a bigger fight. So appropriate authority seems like it's almost built in, right? It's going to be hard to, it's going to be hard for a conflict to be a war if it's not declared by the actual ruler of a country. Now, there is a sort of, and we're going to get back to this towards the end when we talk about Aquinas' views on sedition, there is this thing running through Aquinas where Aquinas from time to time sounds like he's saying really democratic things given the time period. He says that authority comes from the people and that the point of a kingdom is to benefit the people. And that sounds like a much more modern view than was common in the Middle Ages. I mean, the way kingdoms actually worked in the Middle Ages is the king literally owned the whole country. And the king owned the country because he or one of his ancestors had conquered it. And if the king didn't own some part of the country, it was because someone who served the king owned it. And so Aquinas saying, as he says when he discusses human law, that authority comes from the people, right? And the people have rights and things like that. That can sound a little weird. Now, he always follows that with some claim about the ruler of the country being, in effect, the representative of the people. So Aquinas conceives of kingship as the king representing the people, which was not at all the way most kings thought of their status. And what that holds out the possibility of is maybe sometimes the person who's ruling a country isn't actually a representative of the people, isn't the person the people want to rule them, and so is not an appropriate authority. Now, Aquinas never followed this line of thought out, because this is the kind of thing that could get you into a lot of trouble in the Middle Ages. The King of France would have had something to say about it if he had written something like that while he still lived in Paris. But it does hold out the possibility, and this is something to keep in mind. I'm going to try to rewrite this so it's a little clearer. Something to keep in mind when you apply just war theory today. And that's that sometimes the leader of a country is not a legitimate leader of that country. We're going to talk a lot about that later on in the course. So it might be that such a person can never wage a just war. So appropriate authority is one of the standards. The next standard is a just cause, and this is really the central one. There has to be a good reason for you to go to war. And what Aquinas focuses on is basically the other side in the war having done something wrong. And so the most straightforward case of this is a war fought in self-defense. If somebody else invades your territory, you get to fight back. But that would not be the only potential sin, right? There's all sorts of sins that some other kingdom could commit. For example, Aquinas would have certainly thought it would be sinful for a king to persecute Christians, right? So Aquinas could have used just war theory to justify invasions of pagan kingdoms where Christians were being, pagan kingdoms, infidel kingdoms, things like that, where Christians were being attacked. And just war theory was used to this purpose in, for example, the Crusades. But there had to be a good reason, and that good reason almost always had something to do with the other side having done something wrong that you need to stop or you need to punish. Which means wars of conquest are out. Now, conquest might happen sort of accidentally after a war, but a war whose whole purpose is just to conquer territory is illegitimate, according to this theory. Which means almost all the wars fought in the Middle Ages were illegitimate. Aquinas, again, he never draws out that conclusion. There's a lot of cases where Aquinas seems like he's right on the edge of saying something that would have been really, really radical for the time, but he pulls back. He never follows through the reasoning all the way for the very simple reason that like people would get burned to death, like burned at the stake in this time period quite often. So, you got to be careful. But the war had to be fought for a just cause, and there had to be a right intention. And basically, this is where the first two conditions come together. So you have to be an appropriate authority. You have to be a legitimate ruler of a kingdom or a state in order to wage war. The war has to have a just cause, and that just cause has to be the ruler's actual reason for doing it, right? The ruler can't pretend they're going to war for one reason, which would be a good reason, but actually be going to war for a totally different reason, right? So, for example, there were in the second war that America fought against Iraq, and this is the one that started in 2003, there were many, many reasons put forward. Before the war, the most prominent reason put forward was the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was going to deliver those weapons of mass destruction to terrorists, and that we needed to stop them. Then the war started, and we invaded, and we conquered the country really quickly and didn't find any weapons of mass destruction, and in fact found plenty of evidence that Iraq hadn't had any weapons of mass destruction for like over a decade. And then people started changing the reason why the war needed to be fought. They started saying, well, the reason is Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, before we invaded it, conquered it, captured him, and executed him, that he was, a bad man who did bad things to his people. Now, either of those explanations, either of those causes, if they had actually been true, and the second one was true, Saddam Hussein was a very bad person who did very bad things to his people, would be just causes, probably, on Aquinas' view. Like if someone's about to attack you, and you know that, then you don't have to wait for them to start killing you to do that. I mean, that would be like, if you were to think about it in the analogy of self-defense, if somebody's coming at you with a knife, you don't have to wait for them to stab you before you, start defending yourself. You can defend yourself before they've actually, attacked you. So that's a pretty good reason. And, stopping a dictator from committing genocide is also a good reason. But the entire time it was pretty clear that there were other reasons that were actually involved. There were lots of other countries in the world where people were doing bad things to their people, where dictators were doing bad things to their people. There were lots of other countries in the world that had demonstrably more developed weapons of mass destruction programs than Iraq had. But some of those countries didn't have any oil. I'm thinking here in particular of North Korea, which had was very far along on nuclear weapons, right, when we invaded Iraq, and was doing terrible things to, and still is doing terrible things to its own people. We didn't invade them. Why didn't they? Didn't have oil. That seemed to be the explanation. Now, I don't know whether that's true. A lot of ink has been spilled on discussing why we went to war in Iraq. But here's the thing. If it was really for oil, if it was about controlling the oil in Iraq, then even though there might have been good reasons to go to war, it would still fail to be a just war because the intention of the authority was wrong. It didn't match the just cause, right? So the just cause has to be the actual reason why the war is being fought for it to meet these standards. Now, these are the only three standards Aquinas puts forward. Modern just war theory has more standards. And they change the theory in significant ways, but we'll see that towards the end of the course. But this is just war theory as Aquinas presents it. Now, there's something he doesn't talk about in the article, or the question rather, on war, but that he talks about a little bit later. And that has to do with, like, what kind of stuff are you allowed to do in war? And so, for example, he takes up the question, is it okay to kill innocent people? And his answer is no, right? If you're going to go to war, you can only kill the guilty, which would mean lots of practices we have in war today where, we're doing things that we know will kill innocent people would be ruled out. And the principle he uses to justify self-defense, both personally and wars of self-defense, but disallow killing of the innocent, is something called the doctrine of double effect. Although Aquinas never calls it this. Doctrine of double effect when he's discussing self-defense and where he's arguing that it is acceptable to kill someone else in self-defense. And the way he defends that is he says actions can have more than one effect. And you can break down the effects into the intended effects and the not intended effects. And whether an action is right or wrong, sinful or not sinful, is determined by the intended effects. Whether or not they happen, by the way. If you intend for something to happen and it's good, but the good thing doesn't happen, that doesn't make your action wrong, according to Aquinas and lots of people who think that way. But then there are the unintended effects. And what he says happens in cases of killing someone in self-defense is your intended effect is to stop them from hurting you. The unintended effect is their dying, which means it's only appropriate to kill someone in self-defense when you have to kill them in order to achieve the intended effect. The idea is you're not guilty of murder in self-defense if killing them was the only way to save yourself, because the actions you were taking were guided by the perfectly legitimate goal of protecting your own life. If they died, or that they died as a result of those very same actions, as long as you didn't intend for them to die, as long as that wasn't your goal, then your action is morally right. So the double effect is the intended effect versus the unintended effect. This makes sense, right? There are, for all our actions, there's things that, result from them that we didn't see coming, we didn't intend. However, the interesting cases are ones where an effect or a consequence of your action is foreseeable but not intended. So think about, killing someone in self-defense. Think about two different cases. So suppose in both cases, somebody's running at you with a knife. And in the first case, you pull out a gun and you shoot them. Maybe you're confident that in, a struggle over the knife, they would win and you would die because they're bigger and stronger than you. So you pull out a gun and shoot them because it's the only way you can think of to stop them. And then compare that to a situation where they're coming at you with a knife and you pick up a shield or something like that, and you throw up the shield in between the two of you, but the shield hits them in such a way that the knife that they were trying to stab you with ends up getting them, right? So you deflect their knife into them and they die. In the first case, their death was foreseeable. You knew when you picked up the gun and shot them that you were going to kill them. In the second case, it wasn't. It was a freak accident. Both of those can be unintended effects, according to the doctrine of double effect. But one of them is a lot more obvious, right? If you kill somebody by accident, it's definitely not murder, right? There's no sense in which you intended it. But of course, if it's foreseen or foreseeable that someone will die as a result of your actions, that makes it a little more difficult to be confident that it's not intended. Now, if it's the case that the only way to save yourself is to kill them, then what you can say is, if there was any other way available, I would have taken it, which means I didn't want them to die, so it wasn't my goal, so it wasn't part of my intention. That seems pretty clear. But then if you apply this to cases of war, things get a little bit less clear. So the doctrine of double effect has been used to justify all sorts of actions which seem, at least on the surface, as though they would violate Aquinas' rule against killing the innocent. So, for example, during World War II, a lot of bombs were dropped. Most of those bombs were dropped by the United States and Great Britain. Germany did do bombing attacks, especially on England. They did it on all the countries they attacked. But we just dropped way more, basically because we, the United States, could make so many more bombs. We did a lot of fighting, the United States did in World War II, but if we're really being honest, the way we chiefly contributed to defeating the Nazis was by just building so much damn stuff. We were supplying the British and the Soviet Union with a lot of material in order to fight the Nazis, as well as our own army. There was one point at which we were, although this was more relevant to the Pacific Theater of War, we were producing an aircraft carrier a day. And that's just nuts, right? That's like a crazy amount of productivity. But anyway, I digress. But during World War II, we dropped just unbelievable amounts of bombs on Germany. And the idea was, well, there were lots of different goals we had. Sometimes it was purely tactical, right? We were dropping bombs on German army emplacements. We were dropping bombs literally on their tanks or on their soldiers. That's something Aquinas would say that's okay, right? If it's a just war, and most people agree World War II, at least the American, British, and Soviet side of it, is a just war because it was a war fought in self-defense. If it's in a just war and you're attacking soldiers, that's fine. But we didn't only attack soldiers. We also attacked what you might otherwise think of as civilian targets. But the idea was this, right? So we were bombing cities. And suppose, or imagine the case, you don't have to really imagine it so much because this actually happened in a lot of cases, but we're going to talk about a generic case rather than a particular case. Just imagine a case where we're flying planes into Germany and we're going to bomb a factory in some German city. And the factory, we're bombing it because it makes parts for tanks. The idea being, if we knock this factory out, Germany is not going to be able to have as many tanks to fight us with, thus saving our soldiers' lives and bringing the war to an earlier conclusion. That's all fine. Those are all fine reasons to do something that takes people's lives, according to Aquinas, because really we're trying to save more lives than we're taking. However, something that was true, it's still true to some extent today, but not that much anymore, but it was definitely true in World War II, is you couldn't control where your bombs went. What basically happened is planes flew over cities, and when they got approximately where they thought their target was, they opened up doors on the bottom of the planes and bombs just fell out. And everyone knew there's a good chance you blow up the factory, but certainly you're going to blow up lots and lots of houses around the factory. So we foresaw that we would kill, with these kinds of bombing runs, many thousands of civilians. But the goal was to take out the factory. The doctrine of double effect, because it says some foreseen effects can be unintended nonetheless because they're not your goal, right? So this is analogous to you picking up the gun and shooting the guy coming at you with the knife, says, or at least has been used. Of course, Aquinas didn't do this because this was 700 years after Aquinas died, but his principle has been used to defend those kinds of bombing attacks. But it can't be used to justify other kinds of bombing attacks we did during World War II. So, for example, from time to time, we would just destroy whole cities. We did this in Germany and we did it in Japan. We would use especially fire bombs for this purpose, which were designed to just burn down whole cities. Dresden was destroyed in this way. Hamburg was destroyed in this way. In Japan, actually, the worst bombing of Japan in World War II was not either of the nuclear bombs, or at least the worst night of bombing, was not either of the nuclear bombs we dropped on Japan. We actually killed more people in one day with the firebombing of Tokyo. And there really was no purpose to this other than to kill lots of people, to break the will of the German and Japanese people so that they would stop supporting the war effort. That can't be justified according to the doctrine of double effect, because then killing of innocent people is the intended effect. And the doctrine of double effect says killing innocent people always has to be unintended if it's going to be legitimate. And you might have thought Aquinas said, no, you can't ever kill innocent people. But actually, the doctrine of double effect says you can, as long as it's not intended. Because, of course, when you think about self-defense, the key thing about self-defense is that your life is at risk. It's not particularly necessary, or it's not necessary for you to be in a situation where you have to defend yourself that the other person intends to kill you. So the case I was using was somebody coming at you with a knife, right? Not only is your life in danger, but someone is intentionally putting your life in danger. That happens, but you can also be put in a situation where your life is in danger even though no one is trying to kill you, but that someone is doing something that is killing you. And so you can kill people in self-defense who aren't guilty of anything, or who count as innocent. And the doctrine of double effect can allow that. But a lot of people have been very skeptical of the doctrine of double effect, because it says you can kill the same number of people in a bombing run as long as you're trying to blow up a factory, but you can't kill that same number of people if your goal is just to kill those people. And a big question about the doctrine of double effect is, how much does the fact that you intend it versus not intending it matter? Like, if the same number of people die, or even if potentially more people die, but you didn't intend their deaths, how does that come out okay when you knew the deaths would happen? And how do we decide when it's appropriate to kill a lot of innocent people, even if it's not our goal? How do we decide when it's appropriate to do that in war? Now, that is a topic that Aquinas doesn't go into much. And this is one of the ways in which modern just war theory expands on Aquinas. Aquinas is mostly focused on, or his theory mostly helps you answer questions about, when it's appropriate to go to war, not what it's appropriate to do once you're in a war. And part of the reason for that is the way wars were fought in the Middle Ages, just these questions didn't arise as much. Wars in the Middle Ages were fought by like hundreds of people, or at most thousands of people on each side. And they would meet in a field and they would fight for a day and then they would go home. Not a lot of people died usually, even among the soldiers. And wars against civilians, it would have been pointless. Like, knights did go around killing people, but not for war purposes, just because knights were violent dudes who killed people. So Aquinas didn't develop a lot of principles for discussing what kinds of actions are appropriate in war and which ones aren't. But the doctrine of double effect is a principle that can be used for that purpose. It can be used for lots of other purposes too. It's a sort of general principle for thinking about when it's okay to do things that harm other people. Because in general, harming other people is wrong. And the doctrine of double effect says, yes, it's wrong, but it's okay to harm other people if you didn't intend it, as long as the benefit of what you're doing outweighs the unintended harm, the unintended but foreseeable harm. Now, the last part of this video is going to be on what Aquinas has to say about sedition and about obedience to authority. Because so far I've been talking about war as though it's, always war between two states, and those are the only wars that can happen. One kingdom fights another kingdom. One state fights another state. But of course, lots of wars are civil wars. Lots of wars are different groups of people within one state or country or kingdom fighting against each other. And very often that takes the form of a fight over who's going to be in charge, where one group refuses to obey the person who's been in charge and fights a war to get rid of them. Just war theory is difficult to apply, at least Aquinas' just war theory is difficult to apply to such cases, but Aquinas does address this issue when he talks about sedition and obedience. So when it comes to sedition, a quick read of Aquinas would say that Aquinas says sedition is wrong. And of course, and it does. According to Aquinas, sedition is wrong. Now, that might make you think that, try and write this again. That might make you think that Aquinas has the following position. And some people do attribute this view to Aquinas. That sometimes what a ruler does is wrong because it violates the natural law. And so that you don't have a duty to obey those laws, human laws that violate the natural law, but that nonetheless you're not allowed to do anything about it. You're not allowed to overthrow the ruler. Because, of course, that seems like it would count as sedition. And Aquinas says sedition is wrong. However, Aquinas says that it only counts as sedition if you're causing a discord in the people, and the people aren't just any collection of individual human beings. A people is a group of people who are united by a common purpose of pursuing the common good, which won't be true if the person who is in a position of authority over those people, and Aquinas does think there's always going to be somebody in charge, there's always going to be a superior that the people have to obey. He says that in the when he's dealing with the article about do you have a duty to obey a superior and do Christians have a duty to obey secular leaders? His answer is yes and yes, although not in all things. But he does think there's going to be a ruler. But if your ruler is not pursuing the common good, if you're among a group of human beings who are ruled by someone who is not organizing your community to achieve the common good, then, according to Aquinas, you're not even a people. And so if you try to overthrow that tyrant, which is what he calls any ruler who's not seeking the common good, if you try to overthrow that tyrant, then you're not actually committing sedition. So Aquinas does think sedition is wrong, but that doesn't mean he thinks it's wrong to overthrow bad rulers. He thinks you can. He doesn't think you always have a right to, though. And this is going to be something that will distinguish him from some other authors we find later. Aquinas thinks that you can overthrow a tyrant in those cases where you won't cause more harm than the tyrant is causing. So you have to imagine the situation is the following. You have a tyrant. The tyrant is passing human laws that violate the natural law. The tyrant is not seeking to promote the common good, but is instead seeking to promote their personal or individual good. However, you won't be allowed to overthrow them if the act of overthrowing them is going to cause more harm than they themselves are currently causing. Just the fact that they're violating the natural law doesn't mean it's okay for you to try to overthrow them, in other words. But any ruler who's not doing that, any ruler who's abiding by the natural law, whose positive laws or human laws that they pass are in accordance with the natural law, and who is trying to achieve the common good, that ruler you have to obey. And that is sort of the sum of what Aquinas has to say about revolution, effectively. And we're going to come back to revolution quite a bit. Almost every author we read is going to talk about it in some way or other this semester. But that is the last of our content about Aquinas.